In the spring of 1828, a group of men arrived on a low, flat stretch of land at the very mouth of Delaware Bay, and began undertaking something never before attempted on that coastline. Their plan was to construct a stone wall in open water. Not behind a headland, not within a sheltered cove, not in any location where the land's contours offered them something to build against, but out in the bay itself, where tides ran powerfully, and northeast gales swept in off the Atlantic with 100 miles of open ocean behind them, and where ships had been meeting their end for longer than any member of that company had been alive. The project had been under consideration since before the Republic was 20 years old. Merchants, ship pilots, and insurance underwriters had been submitting the same petition to the government since the 1780s and 1790s. Delaware Bay was claiming ships, not in extraordinary years or unusual weather, but regularly, as a constant fixture of the coastal trade, much like a treacherous stretch of road wears out horses. What the bay lacked was the one element that could render it safe, a patch of calm water where a vessel caught in bad weather could anchor and wait, with something solid between it and the storm. In 1825, Congress passed an act authorizing the initial survey. 3 years later, it allocated the first funds, and in 1828, the Army Corps of Engineers put men to work at the bay's mouth to construct, from the sea upward, the harbor of refuge that the Delaware coast had never possessed. The wall they were tasked with building would have to rise from the ocean floor, without a foundation that anyone had poured, in water that could not be drained, with no mortar and no engine capable of lifting stone, in one of the most exposed positions along the Atlantic seaboard. The original cost estimate would ultimately prove almost laughably inaccurate. The original timeline would likewise turn out to be far too optimistic. By the time it was largely finished, it would stand as the largest man-made structure on the mid-Atlantic coast, built almost entirely by hand from wooden boats in an open bay, and the men who constructed it would be almost entirely forgotten. To grasp why any of this was necessary, you must understand what Delaware Bay represented in the early Republic, and what Philadelphia meant to the nation that was forming around it. Philadelphia in 1828 was the economic heart of the mid-Atlantic United States. The grain of the Delaware and Susquehanna valleys passed through its warehouses. The iron, flour, and lumber of the Pennsylvania interior moved through its docks. Every ounce of it traveled by water. The Delaware River was the artery, and the bay was the artery's mouth, and every vessel trading with Philadelphia had to navigate that mouth in every season, in every kind of weather, or not reach Philadelphia at all. What Delaware Bay's weather could unleash had been recognized since the first European settlements along those shores. The bay opens almost due east directly into the North Atlantic, and a northeaster building at sea has a clear run of 100 miles of open water before it reaches Cape Henlopen. By the time it arrives, it has developed into the kind of sea that strains wooden hulls against their own frames. The bay's shallowness makes matters worse. Shallow water generates short, steep waves that do not carry a vessel forward like long, deep water swells. They throw a hull sideways. They work the seams apart. They put the deck awash and strain the anchor cable until something gives way. Then there were the shoals. Delaware Bay is filled with them. Extensive flats of hard sand extending from both shores, lying just below the surface at low water, invisible on a cloudy night, and absent from many of the charts a coasting captain might carry. A vessel driven off course in a worsening storm might not detect a shoal until the hull touched it, and by then the discovery came too late. The sea forced the ship harder onto the bottom with each wave, and the wooden hull worked and opened and let the water in, and that was the end of the ship and sometimes the end of its crew. The place had been called the Graveyard of the Delaware, long before any of the men working on the breakwater had been born. The name was not poetic. In any year with serious weather, the number of vessels lost in that bay, or driven onto its shores, or broken on its outer bars, numbered in the dozens. Sloops loaded with flour, brigs carrying lumber and iron, schooners with passengers and mail below decks. Each had done what hundreds of vessels safely accomplished every year, attempting the passage when conditions appeared manageable. Sometimes conditions proved less manageable than they looked, and the vessel and its men paid for the miscalculation. The specific problem was this: when a vessel could not make headway against wind and tide in the bay, there was no recourse but to anchor and wait. A captain riding out a nor'easter on a hook needed holding ground and needed the fetch to be short enough that waves could not build to deadly height. Delaware Bay had good holding ground in places. It had no place where the fetch was short. There was no shelter. There was no lee shore you could make that was not itself full of shoals. The gales that claimed ships in that bay claimed them because there was nowhere to run when running out to sea was as dangerous as staying put. A breakwater would create that shelter where the bay's geography refused to. The plan the Army Corps drew up for the mouth of the bay was simple in its logic and immense in its execution. A long wall of stone would be constructed beginning near Cape Henlopen, running southeast into the open bay, roughly parallel to the shoreline and about a half-mile offshore. The water inside the angle formed by the cape, and the wall would lie calm when the northeast storms blew, sheltered from the full force of the sea. Vessels caught by weather in the upper bay could work their way down to this anchorage, tuck in behind the stone, and ride out the gale in water flat enough to hold an anchor. The wall would need to run long enough to shelter a fleet of hundreds. The surveys set the required length at something close to a mile. The corps officer assigned to begin the work studied the site before committing to anything, noting the water depth across the proposed line, the character of the bottom, and the direction and force of the dominant storms. He reported to his superiors that the work could be done. The method would be rubble stone rough, quarried, placed from vessels working along the line of the structure, built up from the seabed in a wide trapezoidal mound until it crested above the surface. No mortar, no cofferdam, no prepared foundation. The weight of the stone was the argument against the sea, and there was going to be a great deal of weight. The stone was going to come from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania in the 1820s and 1830s was quarry country in its northern and eastern reaches, where the old basement rock of the Appalachians came close to the surface in hard formations of gneiss and granite, dense enough to withstand moving water. The stone gangs who worked those quarries employed the same methods that quarrymen had used for centuries, and the same methods that quarrymen would still be using a generation later on the granite islands of Maine. Two men worked together at a single steel drill. One man held the drill upright against the rock face, his hands wrapped around the shank just below the head. The other swung a heavy sledgehammer down onto the striking face of the drill, a blow with the full weight of his body behind it. After each strike, the man holding the drill rotated it a quarter turn so that the bit would cut a round hole and not bind in the stone. Then the hammer came down again. Swing, rotate, swing, rotate. The sound of it carried across a quarry from first light to last, a steady ringing of iron on steel that did not stop until the shift was over. A missed blow did not merely waste effort. A missed blow landed on a man's hand or wrist with enough force to shatter bone. And the man holding the drill sat inches from the face, eyes half, shut against the chips of stone that flew with every strike, trusting the man swinging the hammer with his hands and sometimes his life. There were no safety glasses. There was no hearing protection. There was a fine gray dust that settled on everything and got into the lungs and stayed there. And the men who worked the drills for years developed coughs that never improved. When the drill hole was deep enough, they packed it with black powder and lit a slow fuse and stepped back. The explosion brought down a face of fresh stone, and the quarrymen went back in and began sorting the rubble. The largest pieces, dense and irregular and heavy, were set aside for the outer face of the breakwater, where they would need to take the direct force of the sea. Smaller pieces would go into the interior of the mound as fill. Everything moved by bar and lever and rope and horse across the quarry floor and down to the loading point. The men who did this work were not all from Pennsylvania. The stone industry of the mid-Atlantic drew laborers from wherever men were hungry enough to take on hard and dangerous work for a day's wages. Irish immigrants arriving in America through the ports of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia in increasing numbers through the 1820s and 1830s made up a large portion of the quarry workforce in those years. They had come from a country that had been stripping them of opportunities for generations, and they found that America had a great deal of stone that needed moving and was willing to pay a man by the day to move it. It was dangerous work, and it was grinding work, and it was exactly the kind of work that a man with no capital and no connections and no trade that a city recognized could get. They took it. The blocks bound for the Delaware Breakwater made a journey of 50 or 60 miles by water from the quarries to the site. They came down to the Schuylkill or to the canal network that threaded the Pennsylvania hinterland on horse. Drawn wagons were loaded onto flat-bottomed stone sloops or barges and carried south to the Delaware River, and then down the river to the bay and around to the site off Cape Henlopen. It was a slow trip, and a single barge could carry only so many tons before it drew too deep to navigate safely. The mathematics of it were plain and relentless. A wall nearly a mile long, containing hundreds of thousands of tons of stone, would require a fleet of vessels making that journey continuously for a very long time. The stone sloops that worked the Delaware Bay site were built for this kind of cargo. They were heavy, shallow, drafted wooden vessels, wide in the beam, riding low when loaded, rigged so that a boom and tackle could be worked off the main mast and out over the side. A crew would sling a block in a rope cradle, swing it out over the water on the tackle, walk the line out until the block reached the end of its drop and let it go. Then they reset the sling and did it again, block by block, load by load, trip after trip, back to Pennsylvania and down again. A crew on the Delaware site in a good week of weather might place several hundred tons. In a bad week, between storms and rough water, and the delays of reloading, they might place much less. What they were building, course by invisible course, was a mountain on the floor of the bay. The foreman tracked the progress of the wall by soundings. A man with a lead line dropped it at intervals across the growing mound and read the depth at each point. A section that had measured 15 feet of water last month and measured 10 feet this month had received 5 feet of stone. That number went into the ledger along with the tonnage placed, and the ledger was the only picture anyone had of what was being assembled on the bottom, because the bottom was invisible. No one on deck could see where the blocks were landing. No one could tell whether a stone had come down square on the mound or had rolled off to the side. The engineers were building a structure they could not observe in a place they could not reach. Guided by nothing but the lead line and the tally of tonnage, and the slow rise of the profile they were tracking in their records. What they had to trust was the physics, which were simple and reliable. Stone placed on stone does not slide away on its own. The rough, irregular faces of the blocks locked against each other and resisted the pull of the currents. The mass of the mound created its own stability. As long as the stone kept coming and the crews kept placing it roughly where the design required, the wall would continue to grow toward the surface. The engineers who designed the wall for Delaware Bay had thought carefully about what they were building and about how the sea would treat it. The instinctive answer to the problem of breaking the force of waves is a wall, a flat vertical face that stands in the water and takes the blow. That is what a seawall looks like, and a seawall works in certain sheltered places against certain modest seas. In the open bay at Lewes, a vertical-faced wall would have been destroyed. A wave does not just push against a flat face. It hits it. The energy of the wave has nowhere to go but back the way it came. The reflected force meets the next incoming wave, and the two collide and the turbulence compounds. The base of the wall begins to feel forces larger than any single wave, wave after wave, storm after storm, until something in the foundation gives or a course of stone tips outward, and the sea dismantles the rest. The Delaware Breakwater was built on a different principle. Its seaward face was not vertical. It was sloped, a long, gentle incline of rough stone running from the deep water at the base up to the crest above the surface. When a wave reached that face, it did not hit a wall. It ran up a ramp. The rough, broken surface of the stone absorbed energy as the water climbed, the way a rough floor slows a sliding weight. By the time the wave reached the crest, most of its force was spent. It broke and fell back down the slope. And when the next wave arrived, the slope was ready to absorb it again. This is why the base of the structure was built as wide as the engineers calculated it needed to be. Hidden under the water, the mass spread out from the visible crest far, more broadly than anything on the surface suggested. What a vessel saw when it came alongside the finished breakwater was a flat working platform 40 feet or so across, sitting a few feet above the high water mark. What held that platform up was a mass of stone that widened steadily as it went down until at the bay floor it covered an area several times the width of the top. Think about that shape for a moment. The surface a person could stand on was a narrow cap on top of an underwater mountain. The mountain was the whole argument against the sea. The cap was just where it ended. If the idea of a generation of men building that mountain by hand on the floor of an open bay is the kind of history you came here for, I want to tell you that the great American story that connects all of this work, the canals and the breakwaters and the tunnels, and the harbor walls that the same hard-handed generation built across the eastern seaboard, is exactly what this channel exists to tell. If you are new here and you have stayed this far, consider subscribing. It is the simplest way to make sure you do not miss whatever comes next. When the outer breakwater was substantially complete, and the inner breakwater had been added to give additional shelter from the ice that came down the bay in hard winters, the total tonnage of stone that had been dropped into Delaware Bay ran to hundreds of thousands of tons. The project had moved through multiple phases of federal appropriation, multiple chief engineers, and multiple generations of workers. The men who placed the final courses had not been born when the men who drilled the first stones were swinging their sledgehammers in Pennsylvania quarries. The cost totaled across all those years, and all those contracts had grown so far beyond the original estimate that comparing the two figures meant almost nothing. The original projection was the kind of number that made a project sound achievable to a Congress that was not yet certain it wanted to spend the money. The final bills were the kind of number that reflected what it actually cost to move hundreds of thousands of tons of quarried stone from inland Pennsylvania to the floor of an open bay of barking canal and barge and horse and rope, and the day labor working from wooden vessels. The chop of Delaware Bay season after season for decades. Congress paid the bills because it had to. The harbor was needed, and because by the time the full cost became clear, far too much had already been placed on the bay floor to stop. The scale of the finished structure was not something that announced itself easily. A visitor standing on the flat-capped surface of the breakwater saw a working platform about 40 feet wide, stretching away in both directions. That was all the structure showed of itself in the air. What was under the water? The base that spread out to many times the width of the visible cap, resting on the floor of the bay, containing the bulk of the total mass of stone, was invisible. The part the world could see was the narrow crown of something vast. Most people who ever stood on it had no idea what was under their feet. The men who built it are mostly gone from the record. This was not a failure of record-keeping. The records of a federal construction project in the early republic were instruments of financial accountability, and they tracked what financial accountability required, which was tonnage placed and dollars spent and contracts fulfilled. They were not designed to remember a man's name. The men who held the drills in the Pennsylvania quarries and loaded the stone sloops and worked the deck tackles in the Delaware Bay chop were hired by the day and paid by the day. And when they stopped appearing at the site, for whatever reason, they were replaced by men who also did not appear in any ledger the project was keeping. Some of them were killed loading stone onto barges in a tidal river, swinging 2-ton blocks over the side of a workboat in open water, clearing quarry rubble while the next charge was being prepared. This was work that demanded absolute attention from everyone involved and rewarded lapses in attention immediately and without appeal. Men were crushed by stone that shifted. Men were caught between hull and dock when the tide ran the vessel in. Men were in the wrong place when a charge went early or a block slipped its sling. None of it appears in the engineering reports. The engineering reports were about progress. The wall was advancing. The tonnage was being placed. The project was moving toward its completion. The men who moved it there are present in those reports only as the mechanism by which stone became a wall. A mechanism the records took entirely for granted. Their monument is the wall. It is the only monument most of them ever got. The breakwater at Lewes worked. And that plain fact is worth stating plainly because it is still true. Ships that had no safe anchorage in a Delaware Bay gale had one now. The vessels that had been driving onto the shores and going down at anchor in open water made the harbor of refuge instead and rode out the storm in calm water behind the stone. The toll that the commerce of Philadelphia had been paying in ships and lives dropped. The harbor that had been described in congressional petitions since the 1780s was there, made of stone that would not rot and would not rust and would not drag off its station in a blow. The Army Corps took what had been demonstrated at Lewes and applied it everywhere, that the same problem existed. They built breakwaters at Buffalo and Cleveland on the Great Lakes, and at Portland and Rockland on the Maine coast, and at a string of harbors along the mid-Atlantic shore. The engineering logic was the same in every case. Rough stone, sloped face, broad base. Weight as the fundamental argument against the ocean. The Delaware Breakwater was not merely a harbor wall. It was the demonstration, the first proof at large scale on the American coast, that a wall of hand-placed stone could hold in open water indefinitely. every harbor improvement project that came after it rested on that proof. You can drive to Lewes today and stand on the shore at Cape Henlopen and look out to where the breakwater runs. A dark, unbroken line low on the water, unremarkable in calm weather. In a flat bay on a summer afternoon, it looks like almost nothing, a feature of the middle distance that the eye passes over without interest. Walk out onto it when the wind is up and the picture changes. The stones underfoot are the stones the quarrymen cut in Pennsylvania more than a century and a half ago. Worn smooth on the surface by generations of weather and by the feet of people who never thought about what they were standing on. On the seaward side, the water is different from the water on the harbor side, working and purposeful, and the long slope of rough, broken stone that faces it has the look of something that has been taking blows for a very long time and has no intention of moving. That is exactly what it was built to look like. The men who designed it and the men who built it intended it to stand in that bay and absorb everything the Atlantic sent without moving. And they built it so well that they have been right for nearly 2 centuries. I keep thinking about the patience that required, not the engineering patience, though that was real. The patience of the men who worked from wooden barges on a wall they could not see, placing stone on a foundation they could not inspect, building something that showed nothing above the surface for years, and then crested and kept rising and eventually became a thing you could stand on and trust with your life. The patience of a generation willing to work on something that would not be finished in their lifetime, in stages funded by a Congress that sent money in pieces and sometimes stopped sending it entirely, in conditions that had been killing ships for a century and were no friendlier to the men who came to tame them. We have concrete. We have GPS. We have machinery that can place a stone with an inch of tolerance and lift 50 tons without asking a man to touch it. We can build faster than those quarrymen could have imagined, and we build things that need to be rebuilt in 40 years. Their wall has been doing its job for nearly 200. I am not sure what that means. I am not sure we still know how to build for that kind of permanence. I would like to hear what you think in the comments.